Okay, so let's get into this. So this talk's called Incredible Futures. And what this is just really me pulling back the curtain a little bit on how I do my futures work. So yes, I do speak on stage and I've done over 300 keynotes over the past 5 to 6 years. But I work with incredible clients. Just like they said, I've worked with United Nations and I've worked with NASA on projects. I've worked with Heineken on projects. I've just been advising Google, Bank of Canada during this very interesting time that we find ourselves in. But like, how do we imagine incredible futures and how do we start thinking like a futurist? So I really help people shift their mindsets from what is to what if. So oftentimes we're really stuck with the tasks that we have in front of us, that quarterly plan, the 12-month plan, the 18-month plan. But really, if we're going to start looking towards the future, we have to start asking what if? What if we make decisions today that affect the future? What if we imagine a future that's incredible and different from today? Imagine how that can work. And the reason that I talk about this shift from what is to what if is that no one can really turn around and say, hey, I don't believe that we should be doing that. And it's like, yeah, but what if the world was going to change? What if it stays the same? Think about these speculative futures. But I always start off by talking a little bit about the industrial revolutions and how we came to be here today. Because the world that we've created, entrepreneurship and innovations, all come from 3 dimensions, basically. They come from communications, transportation, and energy. Now, we've seen this accelerate over the last few years into the 4th industrial revolution. Now, everything's connected by the internet. Everything is having AI embedded in it, and we've got data as a backbone. Some say we've created more data in the last 2 years than the previous 200 before that. And now we're in a world where data is the biggest currency that's out there, and it never runs out. But it's taken a pandemic to see the fragility of the world, to see that everything really did fall apart. It collapsed. So everything from energy, transportation, food supply, healthcare, schooling, policing, equality and equity, democracy, globalization, all of these things have been fundamentally affected, and they're never going back to the way they were before. And in a lot of these cases, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the collapse and the pain that we felt over the past 6 or 7 months has been really difficult to deal with. And a lot of people have grown their anxiety over time. There's been a lot of mental health anguish. So we really have to be kind to ourselves as we emerge out of this very difficult pandemic situation. Now, Albert Einstein said it very well. We cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking we created them. So there's no point going back to energy and thinking about how we created that world dependent on fossil fuels, or electrification and thinking about how we used to generate electricity using nuclear, or how education has sort of stood still for hundreds of years, and now we're in the pandemic era and it's completely falling apart. Kids are in schools and they're scared for their health, and some parents are even just holding people back. So we have to have a completely new way of thinking on the world. I did an interview earlier today on Sirius XM. I spoke about how nostalgia is incredibly dangerous. We've all chatted to our parents and older folks, and they're very nostalgic for the good old times. It's just because they don't remember the bad old times, and really that nostalgia is holding them back from thinking forward. So I'd like you to really retire the idea of nostalgia in your vocabulary and start thinking forward with optimism and hope. Now, I actually think that we've added an extra dimension to these industrial revolutions, and that's of biology. And we're now in this infinitely growing world that I actually call human infinity. And this human infinity that I talk about has still got that energy, transportation, communications. But with biology and the amount of data we're going to create, and us being a vessel for contribution in the world and generation of data, it's just going to become very exciting, and exponential growth is going to really drive us forward. But how do I really work with clients to help them create new futures? Well, it's interesting. I've got a process that over the years I've worked to really hone, and I get feedback from my clients all of the time. I've tried to make it as simple as possible. If you go and look into the world of futurism and foresight, you can find hundreds of different methods of imagining what the future is. Some are very, very simple. Some are incredibly complicated and academic as well. Now, what I'm going to show you today is something that I've created over the last few years, working with trillion-dollar companies and small startups, and it seems to work for everything in between. And governments seem to like it as well. Once we imagine a future, we can build bigger vision, strengthen strategic planning, and anticipate risks today. So that's why I say look out 5, 10, 20 years, speculate, see what could be, and ask what if. Because we can take elements of that narrative back to today and use that to strengthen all of the parts of our business that we're setting up and in that foundation that's going to take us forward. It's surprising how many entrepreneurs I chat to and I say, what's your vision in 3 years? And half of them say, well, we want to be sold. And half of them say, well, we're just focused on sales right now and growth. And it's like, how can you focus on those things without understanding the long-term vision? People like Elon Musk, people like Richard Branson, these people didn't start with short-term visions. They started with very long-term visions into the decades. And that's how we should be thinking as well. And what I do is I actually employ something that I call the Foresight Development Framework. And this Foresight Development Framework's got a number of different parts to it that I'm going to take you through. First and foremost is the principles. And these 3 principles guide me when I chat to my clients because it puts humanity first. So humanity, not technology, plurality, inclusion, and equity. Diversity, bringing people together. Everyone's at the table and everyone's part of the solution. Scientific fact and creativity. We can't deny that science is there, and we can't deny that creativity is boosting science forward. Now, we can draw parallels and lines between lots of different parts of scientific research, but we have to do that with humanity in focus and with that idea of plurality as well. And then this is what I do every single day. I work out, what are the signals of change that are affecting our realities and the realities of my clients. So, what wild solutions are out there changing the world entirely? What areas are attracting investment? What areas are attracting a huge amount of academic research? And once you start to see some momentum and you start reading forums and news scientific journals, you start to see a pattern and you can breathe things together. It's like being plugged into the matrix. Once you can see enough of it, you can actually see it for what it is. An interconnected, interpersonal, innovation-led world where there's lots of momentum being created and hopefully exponential growth. But what I do to make these come alive is to create something that I call hypothetical scenarios. This is what-if storytelling. What if in the year 2050 we see renewable energy being the predominant provider of electricity, and then you talk about situations and the impacts on people and the impacts on business. You can be fantastic yet realistic, and the further you go out, the more fantastical you can be. These speculative futures are incredibly important in the foresight and futurist world, and that speculative fiction is something that we can really embrace. Have you ever written a short story, 50 words, 250 words? I've written stories of 8,000 to 10,000 words. It's incredibly tough to do that, but it helps you understand a future that might come to pass. And you can write these short stories, longer form stories. Go out there, read graphic novels, illustrations, cyberpunk novels, science fiction. All kinds of fiction will help you really understand what a possible future could be. And there's positive futures and there's dystopian futures as well. The book chapter I've written for Bloomsbury that's coming out next June is actually all about designing with dystopia in mind. Because if we can imagine a terrible future, we can plan for a much better future today and we can avoid all the pitfalls. But really around each of these solutions we start to imagine, we look at lots of different dimensions. What are the financial implications, organizational, technical, social, political, environmental, cultural, regulatory. Once we get into that, we can really start to understand, okay, what's the interrelation, what are the transformations, and how do things change? And this really starts to feed into how businesses do strategic thinking today. I spent about 25 years working in technology strategy for some of the world's largest companies like British Airways, the British government and beyond. And really, when you start thinking in these terms and you start adding speculative fiction to that and you start adding hypothetical scenarios, these larger businesses can really get on board with the idea of using foresight and futurist thinking. So how do we do that? Well, there's a process, and I started off by talking about my Foresight development framework, and now what we have is something that takes us forward beyond that. So the first thing I actually do is set a baseline. That baseline allows us to really build out the story. Now, I've taken you through those steps. Obviously, it's quick to talk through, and it can actually take months to get here. But once we understand the transformations, the change, we can start mapping out the ideas of where our solutions are. We can put them into buckets of like, okay, there are these solutions we can outline, and we can map those future solutions within a timeline. We can imagine the evolution of them over time, how they come together, how they contribute, what new solutions are going to go beyond. This is when our thinking gets even more fantastical and creative, and it's a really fun process. And then we can imagine the future and beyond. Go to 20 plus years. What are the implications? What stories can we tell? How is society going to be affected as a whole? And what are the positive outcomes? Also, what are the risks that we might face, and how can we anticipate them today? And that's the next part. We consider the impacts on today. We use a process called backcasting with the team. And when we go into clients, we typically sit down with the client for 3 or 4 days in a room with a number of their design leadership team, innovation leaders, technical leadership, and as many executives as we can lay our hands on. And once we've drawn out this fantastical vision of the future, and we start saying, okay, this happens in 15 years. What does that mean for today? And we start breaking things down across all these dimensions. And it becomes an incredibly interesting exercise because they're almost dissecting their own business today, and they're starting to see the weaknesses there, and they can build in resiliency, and that's hugely important. About 3 or 4 years ago, I worked with YVR Airport. I'm actually flying to YVR Airport from Toronto tomorrow. And in that airport, they wanted to envisage what the world could be like in 2037. Because I'm not sure if you know this, but every 10 years, airports go through a 20-year planning cycle. So what we did, we put together 5 fantastical stories. We animated them. And then we brought people from all of the cities around Vancouver that would use YVR Airport to try and use this futurist thinking that I did, the fantastical stories I spoke about, to actually get them to think about how the world can change today. And here's a short video running through some of those developments I put together.
Plans for the future of YVR are taking shape. Our 2037 master plan is a blueprint for an airport that'll continue to reflect the best of BC. Sustainable, welcoming, and diverse. YVR will be a feast for the senses, a hive of activity and interaction, a business hub for entrepreneurs, and a unique retail experience that is second to none. Help shape the future of our world-class sustainable airport by attending public meetings and sharing your input online.
It's pretty fantastic, and it was really fun to work on this project. I worked with a PR company, Edelman. I worked with the YVR team. We ended up having 3 consultations, ended up turning into 9 consultations. We ended up going on to, I went onto television with Craig Richmond, the CEO, and he used to say, hey, you got to guess which of us is the CEO of YVR and which of us is the futurist. I'm obviously covered in tattoos, so it was easy for people to imagine. Plus, I wasn't the wizened grey-haired ex-jet fighter pilot. So it's kind of a fun project. They really activated new thinking. 13 million media impressions. So being able to tell these stories of the future can help really activate your audience as well. Okay, what does this mean for founders of companies? Well, I actually think that founders are actually futurists as well. We're the people that start to think about, how to take our current position of what is to what if. We're the people that are thinking at least 3 years ahead of everyone else. And we're trying to get traction. We're trying to get people on board with new thinking. But really what we're actually doing is trying to look out 5, 10, 20 years into the future to ask, what if the world was going to change? And I hope that this presentation really gave you some sort of insights into how I run this process. And it's not easy to do. I've got over 25 years of experience in consulting. People are very complicated to work with, but I really do love that. And that's it. That's the incredible futures. That's how I go about doing foresight planning. And that's how I work with my clients. Thank you very much.